Wow. It's incredible. You know, when you mention the small handful of wealthy families who pretty much owned El Salvador in the Reagan 80s, you often think of the infamous death squads that their right-wing military government supported. Here's what Tom Brokaw had to report about them in 1983. Now, remember that year. It's important. On NBC's Evening News.
The death squad strike at anyone they suspect of working for the guerrillas or sympathizing with them, even when friends are involved. But most of the victims are the sons and fathers of the poor, the children and husbands of these women who marched recently against the death squads.
As well as routinely disappearing or killing the oligarch's opponents in gruesome ways that were meant as warnings to others. Few of the death squad members felt so bad about what they did that they later gave on-the-record testimony about it. For example, at a November 1st, 1989 press conference, former Salvadoran soldier, Cesar Vielman Hoya Martinez, said that some of the military units and the intelligence unit that he was part of participated in what he called heavy interrogation, what you and I would call torture. And after that, it was his job to clean up, to kill the victims. He strangled some. He slit the throats of others. He injected some with rat poison. He said they couldn't use bullets to kill them because they might be traced back to the military. He also said that a U.S. advisor worked at the desk next to his and that he reported to him because the U.S. was providing a monthly budget and teaching torture techniques to the Salvadoran military. Another man who outed the Salvadoran death squads operating in his country in the 80s, and a country, by the way, that was mostly owned and run by about 30 very rich families, was Carlos Antonio Gomez Montano, a paratrooper stationed at the Ilopango Air Force Base. And he said that he sat in on 2 torture classes in which a 13-year-old girl and a 17-year-old boy were tortured for demonstration and training purposes in January of 1981. He said that one of his officers told him and his fellow soldiers that watching rape and torture, quote, will make you feel like a man, end quote. Now, you're probably asking yourself, why am I talking about El Salvadoran death squads in 1984? Well, because in the midst of all this, a management consultant with deep connections to the Reagan Republican Party was charged by his boss at Bain Consulting to start a brand new company called Bain Capital. And this consultant was set off in search of new investors. Guess who that consultant was? A young guy by the name of Mitt Romney. And guess where old Mitt went off to find investors? El Salvador. Investigative reporter Justin Elliott looked into this, and what he found led him to write an article for Salon titled, and the title pretty much tells the whole thing, The Roots of Bain Capital in El Salvador's Civil War. Romney tapped El Salvador's wealthy families, including one linked to right-wing death squads. As Elliott notes, quote, back in 1984, wealthy Salvadoran families were looking for safe investments as violence and upheaval engulfed the country, end quote. He points out that the U.S. was enthusiastically supporting the right-wing government of El Salvador, and to quote Elliott, the war, which pitted leftist guerrillas against the right-wing government backed by the Reagan administration, ultimately left over 70,000 people dead in that tiny nation. The vast majority of violence, a UN Truth Commission later found, was committed by rightist death squads and the military, which received U.S. training and $6 billion in military and economic aid. The notorious death squads were financed by members of the Salvadoran oligarchy, that'd be those rich 30 families, and had close links to the country's military. The death squads kidnapped, tortured, and killed suspected leftists. End of quote from Salon. So who were the oligarchs who owned and ran El Salvador? Well, according to Elliott, one of the most prominent families was the De Sola family, and Mitt Romney recruited 4 of their members to provide much of the initial funding for Bain Capital. Again, Elliott writes in Salon, 4 members of the De Sola family were among the original Bain investors or limited partners in the company, the Globe reported. Their relative and one-time business partner, Orlando De Sola, was an important figure in El Salvador, a well-known right-wing coffee grower with, in his own words, authoritarian visions for his country. De Sola spent time living in Miami, but was also a founding member of the hard-right Arena Party, the right-wing, Arena Party. End of quote. That family was a big part of the ruling party of the country at the time, according to 2-time Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Craig Pies, who's quoted by Elliott as saying that Orlando De Sola, quote, was in the inner circle of the group around de Aubusson At the time, the D'Aubusson was well known to be involved in the death squads. De Sola's name appears on a December 1983 FBI cable as one of 29 people suspected by State Department officials of furnishing funds and weapons to Salvadoran death squads. Now, that was the year that Romney was raising money back then, okay? In August of 2007, Mitt Romney told the Miami Herald that he'd traveled to Latin America at least a dozen times in search of startup money for Bain Capital. That money eventually represented about 40% of all the outside cash he brought in. He even bragged about hunting for cash among some of the most authoritarian and brutal regimes in the world, telling Herald reporter Andres Oppenheimer that, quote, "The investments for the company that I started, Bain Capital, came largely from Latin America. My largest single investors came from El Salvador, Ecuador, Colombia, and Guatemala." End of quote from Mitt Romney. All of these countries where the then Reagan administration was secretly funding death squads and violent right-wing governments or right-wing insurgencies. So the question, if the media wants to know what rubbed off on Obama when he was sitting in Reverend Wright's church, how come nobody's asked what rubbed off on Romney when he was sitting with the oligarchs in El Salvador, Colombia, and Guatemala? It may well be that the other shoe is about to drop on the Bain story, and that it isn't about a factory that was shut down with its work sent overseas. Instead, it may be that at its birth, Bain was contaminated with blood money. Keep an eye on this story.